Bonjour tout le monde.
Good morning.
Each fall, as the international community comes together at the United Nations General Assembly in New York, we have the chance to carry the voice of Canadians to the world. It's an opportunity to reaffirm Canada's commitment to creating a peaceful and prosperous world, not just today, but well into the future. Canadians understand that we're living in an age of both unprecedented new opportunities and economic growth, and truly global challenges like a warming climate and rising inequality. To solve these problems, we'll have to work together on solutions that not only benefit our countries as a whole, but that empower each and every individual, no matter where they live. That's why Canada is focused on closing the gaps that persist, whether it's the gender gap, income inequality, or a lack of opportunity for youth, so that everyone has the chance to thrive. À l'Assemblée générale des
At the United Nations General Assembly this year, we have worked hard in order to come up with new ways of financing sustainable development, investing in education of girls across the world, and working together with African leaders in order to create jobs for young people.
Here at the UN was honor a leader who was the first living person to become an honorary Canadian citizen and whose message of peace inspired so many Canadians and people around the world, Nelson Mandela. At the Nelson Mandela Peace Summit on Monday, I spoke about his legacy and the duty we share to carry it forward. Mandela reminded us that our fate is not merely our own, but tied to that of our fellow citizens and fellow humans. His conviction that we must work together to build a better future is the very foundation of our work here at the United Nations. Mandela's message doesn't just apply to peace, but to prosperity, too. On Monday, I joined the UN Secretary General and other leaders at the high-level meeting on financing the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development to talk about how we can now bridge the gap between current resources and the flow of capital that's needed to make Agenda 2030 a reality. That's why Canada announced our investment of $20 million for the Global Infrastructure Hub, a new tool that will help get money flowing to the communities that need it.
Canada is undertaking efforts to arrive at more innovative and more effective solutions to finance sustainable development. We shall do our utmost to find meaningful solutions over the long term, which will be beneficial for all.
On Monday, I also hosted a roundtable with heads of state and heads of government to talk about investing in education for the most vulnerable girls and women across the globe. Notre travail donnait suite.
Our work has been a follow-up to the leadership that we showed this summer at the G5. Together with our partners, our international partners, Germany, the UK, and so forth, we have undertaken to invest 3.8 billion Canadian dollars in the education of women and girls in crisis and conflict. In recent days, Denmark, Norway, and others have announced that they will be joining the Charlevoix Declaration on education for girls and women in developing countries, particularly those in a crisis situation, with a total contribution of 527 million Canadian dollars in order to allow all children to have access to high-quality education. Of all our successes during this session of the UNGA, I'm very, very proud of this very important gesture towards girls and women.
Denmark, the Netherlands, Norway, and Qatar have announced that their work will align with the Charlevoix Declaration on quality education for girls, adolescent girls, and women in developing countries, with a total contribution of more than 527 million Canadian dollars. Of everything that we've achieved at this United Nations General Assembly, this is the outcome of which I am most proud. Because this growing support for education is great news for millions of girls, our next generation of young women who will be able to succeed no matter what profession they choose. Along with President Macron and Prime Minister May, I had the opportunity yesterday to continue this conversation at the 12 Years to Break Barriers and Leave No Girls Behind event. We talked about how education empowers girls to not only lift up their communities, but to become the innovators and visionaries who will invent the next big thing in tech and lead countries to peace. And finally, yesterday, I was at the African Youth Employment Roundtable with Prime Minister May, President Kagame, President Akufo-Addo, investors, youth, and NGO partners, along with other heads of state. Our conversation brought together everything we've been working on over the last 3 days. Because although many African nations have seen unprecedented economic growth, others are dealing with rising economic inequality and young people who don't have the jobs they need to reach their full potential. But with the right support, youth across Africa will create transformative results that will shape a bright future for everyone. Comme c'est le cas pour les filles.
As is the case for girls, the aim is to carry out wise investments if we wish to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Governments and the private sector need to invest to bridge the gaps, to help to eradicate poverty, to combat climate change, and to generate new opportunities for all.
I've been in New York. I've also had the chance to meet with President Macron and sit down with Prime Minister Ardern and President Piñera to talk about advancing our common trade agenda. Our discussions were an opportunity not only to reinforce the strong relationships between our countries and create more opportunities for our citizens, but also a chance to discuss how, as leaders, we can move the needle on the most pressing issues of our time. Cette année,
This year's session of the UNGA has been extremely productive for Canada. I look forward to pursuing our work with other countries using as an intermediary such fora as the United Nations so as to truly change the world. It's true, we are stronger when we work together in order to rise to common challenges and to build a more peaceful, equal and stable world.
International cooperation will be prominently featured in Minister Freeland's address to the General Assembly on Friday, because that's what Canadians expect, that we stand up not just for ourselves, but for everyone, that we make sure that people have jobs that will set them up for success, that every girl gets to go to school, that when we look back to this day, we know that we did what we had to do to set the next generation on the path to success, that this was a moment where we invested in a better, more peaceful world. That's what Canadians expect. Thank you. I'm happy to take your questions now.
Bonjour, Monsieur Trudeau, Madeleine Blais-Morin.
Hello, Madam from Radio Canada. I'd like to return to your aiming to achieve a seat at the Security Council of the United Nations. At what point did you feel that you had sufficiently the support of the Canadian people in this regard? It is important for us to understand, first of all, that this is not an end in itself. This is a means for Canada to continue to remain engaged at the highest levels of discussions at the United Nations worldwide so as to promote human rights, to promote democracy, so as to see to it that the Canadian people can continue to contribute to at the level that people expect of us worldwide. The conversations that I had with Canadian people across our country reinforce the fact that they are aware of the fact that we shoulder responsibility to remain engaged constructively and positively worldwide, especially given the tremendous challenges which we are presently facing.
Pouvez-vous répéter en anglais, s'il vous plaît?
Could you repeat that in English?
People need to remember that attaining a seat on the Security Council for Canada is not an end in itself. It's a means to an end. It's a means to ensure that Canadian voices are part of the highest level discussions in advancing democracy and defending the rule of law and defending human rights. Canadians expect us to look for ways to have a positive impact on the world. Canadians expect themselves to be part of conversations that create greater prosperity, greater opportunity for all. And this is a meaningful way for us to advance causes that are important to Canada and to Canadians, like human rights, at a time where the world is certainly under various types of stress.
Vous avez eu plusieurs rencontres.
You had a number of meetings with international leaders. I imagine that that was an opportunity for you to request their support. What's your level of confidence from 1 to 10 in getting a seat. I think that it's impossible to predict the outcome of the elections in advance. We are working very, very hard, and we have full confidence that in the diplomatic action that we're carrying out right now, our leadership is very important in terms of human rights, democracy across the world, and this shows that Canada stands ready to make a positive and constructive contribution to overcoming the challenges that our world and its citizens are facing today.
To the International Criminal Court. As you know, the U.S. administration has declared the court dead to us just a couple of weeks ago, and is threatening sanctions against its judges and prosecutors and so on. So in addition to the message to Venezuela itself, I'm wondering what kind of a message are you trying to send about the court to the United States?
I think the message is that the situation in Venezuela is catastrophic. There is a humanitarian crisis going on in a country that used to be one of the most successful and prosperous countries in South America. The failure of leadership in South America, in Venezuela, is of concern not just to us, but to leaders in the region, friends to Venezuela, and concern to the world. And Canada is pleased to use all different paths that we can to help the Venezuelan people. We are pleased to be joining with a broad number of other countries to continue to look for solutions to this, including using the International Criminal Court. And might I say that in my conversations with American officials and leaders, the concern that we share, both of us as countries, on Venezuela is real, and we are always looking forward for ways to help the Venezuelan people.
I think that we all are aware of the fact that the crisis plaguing Venezuela has become a humanitarian disaster, humanitarian catastrophe. This is a challenge which afflicts millions of people, not just in Venezuela, but in neighboring countries as well. This is a crisis that is even worse because of the fact that it's compounded by the fact that Venezuela, just up until a few years ago, Venezuela was certainly one of the most successful, one of the most prosperous countries in South America. And it is incumbent upon all of us as an international community, especially American nations, to work together to attempt to lend a hand, help the Venezuelan people. For this reason, we are harnessing the various tools at our disposal. I can assure you that in the conversations that I've had with the Americans, they are very pleased at the work that we have been doing together in various ways to attempt to bring peace and security and assistance to people in Venezuela.
Prime Minister, I know the humanitarian situation in Venezuela is unique in our hemisphere, perhaps, but I want to ask about another country, Cuba, which is, if anything, less democratic than Venezuela, and has just had a completely undemocratic transfer of power. But Canada is not condemning it in the same way. And I'm wondering, why do we have what appears to be a double standard? And to what extent are you influenced by your own family's personal connections to that island and to the Castro family?
I think, first of all, to look at the state of crisis, of near starvation, of violence that is going on in Venezuela, and to compare it to a country that is not facing those levels of calamitous humanitarian crisis is unhelpful. Obviously, we continue to work hard to promote human rights around the world, including in Cuba. The conversations I've had with Cuban leadership over the course of my tenure have always included human rights and a push for better respect for democracy and to move in the right direction. And we will continue to encourage Cuba and all countries around the world that are at various points on the path towards true democracy to continue moving in a way that respects their citizens and the freedoms that we continue to take for granted in Canada.
Prime Minister, there's a lot of interest in what appeared to be an awkward moment between you and President Trump at that luncheon yesterday. Could you describe what happened there exactly and whether we should read anything into it about how your personal relationship with him has changed since Charlevoix?
I have continued to engage regularly with the President. We had a very good call just last week. We continue to have regular conversations whenever necessary, whenever we want to. I don't think there's anything to read into it. I was thanking the President of South Africa for his extraordinary speech on Venezuela, on Nelson Mandela, and I noticed I moved around the table to say hello to the Prime Minister of Italy, and then shook hands with President Trump while he was rereading his notes for his speech, the toast he was about to give. It was an interaction like so many are in UN, quick but cordial. There are all sorts of opportunities for me to speak with President Trump, and that was not the time.
So it was an interaction like so many other interactions that take place in the United Nations. It was a short but cordial one. He was preparing his speech, which he was about to give, and I just wanted to greet him. I have many opportunities to have conversations with President Trump during United Nations Week, General Assembly Week. There are so many heads of state and of government here from all over the world. And we have very easy access to each other. We don't particularly need to spend a lot of time together because there are many, many opportunities for us to talk about important things.
Council, why are you not giving the address to the General Assembly and leaving it instead to your foreign minister?
I have been pleased to deliver a number of addresses to the General Assembly in past years. I have continued to engage at a range of conferences on important issues to Canada. Canada's voice has been present and very noticed over these past few days. I have tremendous confidence in our extraordinary and tireless foreign minister in being able to ably represent Canada and Canadians on Friday afternoon at her address to the Assembly.
Good morning, Prime Minister. With respect to NAFTA, you and the Foreign Minister have repeatedly said that you will not negotiate in public. But yesterday it seemed as though Ambassador Lighthizer was doing just that by suggesting in some comments that Canada has not given up enough in NAFTA, is not willing to budge enough, that the American deadlines are in fact firm. Do you find those comments harmful to the process, and are you worried that perhaps the Americans have a different outlook on where talks are at than you and Minister Freeland do?
We continue to engage in near continuous negotiations. The conversations are constant and ongoing. We are very much looking in a positive, constructive way to getting to a renewed NAFTA that will be a trilateral agreement between Canada, Mexico, and the United States. As I've said many times, I will not negotiate in public. We will continue to stay focused on getting a good deal for Canadians, recognizing that it is very possible to get to a deal that is both good for Canadians, good for Americans, and good for the entire continent. We will stay focused on that. We will keep working as long as it takes to get to the right deal for Canada.
Is it possible to get to that point even if the U.S. moves on with just Mexico in the short term?
We will keep working on a broad range of alternatives. A broad range of paths are ahead of us. We're going to keep focusing on trying to get to the right deal for Canadians as we move forward on negotiations.
We will continue to negotiate in an ongoing manner over the days we seek to work and to engage in constant communication with the negotiators. And we will continue to see to it that there be a good agreement for the Canadian people, for Canada, well aware of the fact that it is very possible to have a good agreement for Canada and that this can also be a good agreement for the United States and for Mexico.
Prime Minister, thanks for taking our question. Since we're in the United States, or at least in close proximity to it, I wanted to ask you a question about a matter that's on the minds of many Americans today. That is the Supreme Court confirmation hearing that's resuming tomorrow. Given everything that we've heard, given the allegations that are out, I'm wondering if you think that that proceeding should go ahead as is planned, or whether we need to take a pause and have a more thorough investigation of the allegations that are out there.
Obviously, I'm not going to comment on processes that are extremely internal to the United States.
Do you believe Christine Blasey Ford?
That is not for me to say. As we have taken very seriously as a government and as a country the Me Too movement, Time's Up. We recognize that we need to ensure that anyone is working in a place or living in a space free from harassment or intimidation, and that requires a shift in both behavior and perspective, one that Canada is working very hard on.
Good morning, Prime Minister. Michelle Zilio from the Globe and Mail. Yesterday, President Trump criticized in very strong language the International Criminal Court during his speech to the UN and said the U.S. will provide no recognition of the court. Can I please get your reaction to his comments on the ICC?
Canada continues to believe that the ICC is a useful and important way of promoting an international rules-based order. Canada has always been a strong voice for defending human rights and for the rule of law, and we will continue to be. Canada
recognizes that the International Criminal Court is an important institution in terms of promoting human rights and a rules-based society, a rule of law society across the world, and we will continue to support it.
Note, in light of the UN report on the Rohingya crisis and the House of Commons declaration that this is in genocide, I want to get a very straight answer from you. Do you believe that Aung San Suu Kyi is still deserving of her honorary Canadian citizenship?
I think that's one of the questions that certainly Parliament can reflect on. It was Parliament that granted her honorary citizenship, and that's a conversation that we could certainly have. But I think let's be very clear: the hundreds of thousands, indeed millions of people who are affected by this Rohingya crisis, by this genocide, whether or not Aung San Suu Kyi has Canadian citizenship or not, honorary or not, makes no difference in solving this crisis. And Canada is entirely focused on solutions that will move forward to protect these citizens, these individuals, to support them, to put an end to this ongoing humanitarian crisis.
I think that we acknowledge the fact that this is a discussion, a conversation that some wish to have, and we can have this conversation. However, acknowledging the fact that Aung San Suu Kyi, whether or not she has honorary Canadian citizenship, this will not have a positive nor a negative any impact on the millions of people who we wish to assist, the victims of this humanitarian crisis. And that is what needs to be our goal. And that is what we are seeking to achieve with the international community, is to attempt to bring an end to this crisis and to help those people who are under extremely difficult circumstances. We've acknowledged this as having been a genocide.
Thank you. Celia Mendoza from Voice of America. Prime Minister, we know that Canada joins these efforts now. Why right now? We know it's been a long time since Venezuela has been having trouble. What brings you to join the efforts of the 5 Latin American countries that are signing the letter? We also know that President Trump this morning said that he will be willing to meet Nicolás Maduro here at the United Nations. We understand he will be actually attending the United Nations. Will you be willing to talk to him as well? And finally, on that note, the humanitarian crisis that is being lived by the Venezuelans is being completely denied by the government of Nicolás Maduro as in a strategy, a media strategy, as fake news, and for countries to try to invade and to take over his country. How you respond to that, especially with this letter that now is going to go to the ICC?
I think, first of all, to make things very clear, Canada has been engaged actively and forcefully in addressing the crisis in Venezuela over the past months and indeed years. We are a part of the Lima Group. When I was down at the Organization of American States summit in last year, earlier this year, we were very active in convening the Lima Group in talking about how we can continue to put pressure, and we certainly agreed that we would use a broad range of tools, and this is one of the latest ones. I have no plans to meet with Maduro this week, but obviously it is something that is of significant concern to us, and I think one of the ways that the Maduro government has positioned itself as under attack from external forces is why it has been so important that Canada has associated itself with countries who are friends and traditional friends and neighbors to Venezuela. This is not about political governance. It is about a humanitarian crisis that is impacting the lives of millions of people, not just in Venezuela where they are hit hardest, but people fleeing to neighboring countries. Canada stands with our friends and allies in South America, across Latin America. We will continue to be there to support, to provide our participation in a broad range of initiatives, and we will continue to make very, very clear that this is a failure of leadership by the Maduro government and by Nicolás Maduro personally, and the suffering of the Venezuelan people must cease, and that is what we are working on to try and reach in a consensual way with our friends in South America.
Yes, David Lauder with Reuters. Thank you, Prime Minister. Just returning to Ambassador Lighthizer's comments yesterday, he said that the steel and aluminum tariffs will be dealt with separately from NAFTA. Do you think it's possible to reach a NAFTA deal without addressing those issues? And does Canada need to see some kind of ironclad commitment that Canadian auto exports to the United States won't be subject to tariffs or quotas? Thank you.
One of the things in my many conversations with President Trump on the issue of 232 tariffs writ large and indeed specifically was his insistence that, well, if we renegotiate NAFTA, if we get to a NAFTA deal, there will be no need to worry about these other things. That has been something that he has said a few times. We are continuing to work on getting to a right deal for Canada, right deal for Canadians, and that involves obviously feeling confident about the path forward as we move forward, if we do, on a NAFTA 2.0, and the freer and lack of punitive tariffs that we consider are unjust. Merci beaucoup tout le monde. Thank you very much.
Mr. Prime Minister.
Yeah.